I'm Jason Gittins. I work for ADAS, which is a consultancy company, and over recent years we've done several reports for BFREPA in terms of costings and issues going on in the poultry industry. And the subject today is to talk about the report we've just done on retailers' intentions for eggs in 2025 and costs of barn production. So let me just start with the background to this piece of work. Back in 2016, a number of major retailers announced that they would adopt a non-cage policy for shell eggs in 2025. As a result, it looked as though the retail sector would be predominantly non-cage by 2025, with little place for enriched cage eggs by that time. In 2017, ADAS prepared a report for BFREPA which looked at the likely implications of that for the free-range sector and whether there was need for any further production in this country to meet the expected increase in demand. But at that time, barn egg production standards were unclear. There was thought that individual retailers might adopt their own standards rather than having one agreed standard which most of the industry, if not all of it, would comply with. Since 2017, there's also been an increase in the free-range sector of around about 14%, but that has been offset by a shrinkage in the enriched cage sector, which amounts to around 7%. And of course, there have been some changes in retailers' policies since then. For instance, we've seen Morrison's adopt a free-range and organic policy rather than just non-cage since then. So the objectives of the 2020 report that we did for BFREPA were first of all to compare the costs of production for free-range and for barn production. And for this, we used a combination of forecast flock performance in 2025 and added to that current costs for things like feed and pullets and housing. And the reason for doing it like that was because of the difficulties of trying to predict what feed costs in 2025 might actually be. Whilst it's assumed that most, if not all, of the barn production will be to Lion Code standards in 2025, we did prepare a separate costing for barn production which is not to Lion Code standards, just in case there was a need for that. And finally, we looked at the likely free-range requirements of the UK in 2025, and we compared that with the current supplies and the number of bird places in place at the moment. And we did that to see whether there was a need for any expansion in the sector between now and 2025. So first of all, we looked at the costs of production for free range in 2025. And for this, we used the high-performance, low-cost model, which we prepare for the ranger each month, rather than the average performance. And the key aspects of flock performance that we used for that were assuming an egg output of 345 eggs per bird to 76 weeks. We assumed a feed intake of 126 grams per bird per day and an average feed cost of £240. And to that we added the average capital cost for new houses and equipment of £35 per bird. And then based on those assumptions, the cost of production we calculated from that was an average of 88.8 pence per dozen for free range in 2025. And you can see that around about 50% of that is due to the cost of feed. Turning then to barn production, and just a reminder of the key barn requirements under the Lion Code scheme, they specify a maximum of 16.5 birds per square metre on the floor, and also a maximum of 4 tiers, and there are limits in for colony size as well and for enrichments. So the expectation for barn production in 2025 is that it will be conducted in houses which were formerly used for enriched cage production. It's assumed that most of these houses were built in the run-up to the ban on conventional cages in 2012. So they are a number of years old, and we've assumed in our main figures that all depreciation and interest charges for those houses will now have been completed, so there are no costs associated with that. However, in a separate sensitivity analysis, we have considered that as a possibility because it may apply to a small number of cases. The conversion costs from enriched cage houses into barn vary between around £12 a bird for single-storey systems, going up to around £20 per bird for double-storey systems. And we took an average then of £16 per bird as being an average across the industry on that basis. So for barn production to Lion Code standards, the main assumptions we made were an output of 350 eggs per bird to 76 weeks, as opposed to 345 for free range. We assumed a feed intake of 122 grams per bird, as opposed to 126. We assumed a slightly lower feed cost of £235 per tonne because of the likelihood of larger deliveries. And as was said, the capital cost was assumed to be £16 per bird, so a big difference compared to the £35 per bird we had assumed for free range. So based on those assumptions, we calculated the average cost of production for barn eggs to Lion Code standards to be 75.5 pence per dozen, so quite a decrease compared to the free range costs. And then we looked at the cost of production for barn eggs if they were not produced to Lion Code standards. If that was adopted by producers, they could potentially use a higher stocking density, and we assumed a stocking density there of 22 birds per square metre of floor area rather than the previous 16.5. And one of the effects of that would be to reduce the capital costs from £16 per bird down to £12 per bird. We also assumed that feed intake would reduce by 2 grams per bird down to 120 grams, and that egg output would be reduced by 5 eggs down to 345 eggs, so equal then to the assumption that we'd made for free range. Based on this set of assumptions for non-Lion Code barn eggs, we then have a figure of 71.3 pence per dozen as the cost for 2025. So putting all those costs together, we then have the cost of free range at 88.8. We have the cost of barn eggs to Lion Code standards at 75.5 and 71.3 for any barn which is produced to non-Lion Code standards. And looking at that in percentage terms, you can see that that represents a reduction of around about 15% and 20% respectively. So the clear conclusion is that the cost of production for barn is less than it will be for free range. And another important point that was raised by industry whilst compiling this report is the likelihood that packing costs would also be lower for barn eggs because of the use of inline systems and the consequent savings on transport by picking up eggs from remote sites and also packaging as well. So we used our best assumptions for each of those, but it was useful also to do a sensitivity check to look at the effect of changed assumptions on barn and to see whether there were realistic scenarios whereby the cost of barn production could approach, reach, or even exceed the costs of free range. So to do that, we looked at the effect of increasing the housing cost from £16 to £22 per bird. We assumed that there would be no difference in egg output between free range and barn. We assumed that the feed intake in a barn unit would increase from 122 to 124. And finally, we assumed that labour costs would increase by 20 pence per bird. The combined effect on those were to increase the production costs up to 81.1 pence per dozen, and that still represented a saving compared to free range of around about 9%. The next part of the report was to look at egg requirements for 2025. So the projected requirements for eggs in the UK in 2025, we started off by looking at the current requirement, and that comes to a total of around about 36.3 million cases of eggs per year. And we based that on current per capita consumption and the population of the UK at the present time. Now, industry statistics forecast that there will be a 3% increase in human population between now and 2025. And on that basis, the requirement for eggs would increase up to 37.3 million cases, assuming the same per capita consumption of eggs at that time. So if those retailers who have adopted a non-cage policy in 2025 switch just to barn production, then there will be no direct effect in the free-range sector at all. There will simply be a switch from enriched cage to barn as the cheapest alternative. But clearly there could be free-range expansion if there is a voluntary consumer change, particularly in the years between now and 2025. So this slide shows the projected free-range egg sales by 2025 by market outlet. And we've used a combination of published and industry figures to arrive at these estimates. So we looked at free-range egg sales through the three main outlets of the retail sector, which comprises 59% of the total, food service, which represents 20%, and the processing sector, which accounts for the remaining 21%. So we took that forecast figure of 37.3 million cases, and we worked out for each of those sectors how many eggs would be required. We then looked at the number of free-range and organic eggs which were sold through each of those outlets on a percentage basis, and this was mainly based on industry figures. So you see there that 67% of all retail eggs are free-range and organic, 41% goes into food service, and free-range represents 53% for the processing sector. On that basis, we forecast a requirement for free-range and organic eggs amounting to 22.9 million cases per year by 2025. So the final question was whether the current amount of free-range production that we have in this country was sufficient to meet that expected requirement by 2025. We started off by assuming that 2% of that total is organic, as it is at the moment. So that leaves a figure of 21.5 million cases requirement in this country for free-range eggs alone. We then looked at the number of free-range places in the UK and multiplied that by the number of eggs per bird, as we have assumed earlier, and we arrived at a figure of 21.2 million cases of eggs likely to be produced by the current housing stock in 2025. So there was a calculated shortfall of around about 0.3 million cases per year. And calculating that through, that's the equivalent of just below 400,000 bird places for free range in total. And that represents the need for an increase of only around about 2% by 2025. And bear in mind that we say there's been a 14% expansion in free range since the time of our 2017 report. So that puts it into perspective. So the main conclusions from the report were that the cost of production for free range will be higher than the cost of production for barn. And so those retailers who have adopted a non-cage policy but still wish to have entry-level, cheaper egg available for sale are much more likely to adopt barn production than free range. On that basis, requirements for free range are most likely to increase if there is a voluntary change to free range by consumers, perhaps young consumers buying for the first time between now and 2025, or if any of the main retailers switch from a non-cage policy to a free range and organic only policy prior to 2025. Then there are the wider issues to consider, such as the implications of the end of the Brexit transition period at the end of 2020 and the economic impacts of coronavirus, which make any forecasts for the future not without difficulty, and the situations could change as a result of those and other factors between now and 2025. But with current assumptions and retailer policies in place, our conclusion is that little free-range expansion appears to be needed in the UK at the present time. So that concludes my presentation, and I'd welcome any questions or comments. Thank you.